A girl in a faded blue dress stood alone in the marble hall of the tallest tower in Lagos, clutching a sealed envelope stamped with a red wax mark that seemed far too old for a building made of glass and steel. She had asked for only 5 minutes with the man who owned the tower. Nothing more, just 5 minutes to place a letter in his hands. But before Damien Adeyemi could step out of the elevator, his fiancée reached the girl first, snatched the envelope from her fingers, and tore it into pieces in front of dozens of watching employees. "Girls like you only ever bring one thing into a place like this," she said, letting the shredded paper fall onto the polished floor like snow that did not belong in a city built on heat and ambition. No one in that hall understood, not yet, that scattered across the marble were the final words of a dead man, and that those words were about to tear apart everything the Adeyemi family believed was solid ground. Lagos woke the way it always did, in two completely different worlds that happened to share the same sky. On Victoria Island, glass towers caught the early sun and turned it into gold, while black cars with tinted windows slid past guards in crisp uniforms who never once looked twice at the men who paid their salaries. Miles away in Ajegunle, the morning arrived through cracked windows and the smell of frying plantain, through narrow lanes where water had to be carried in buckets, and electricity came and went like an uncertain guest. It was in that second Lagos, the one the glossy magazines never photographed, that Amara Okoye opened her eyes inside a room barely large enough for a bed and a single wooden chair. She was 27 years old, and she had spent most of those years learning how to survive without ever once losing the steadiness in her eyes, the kind of calm that made people trust her, even when they had every reason not to. That morning, before she did anything else, before she even reached for water to wash her face, she checked the small cloth pouch beneath her pillow, because inside it was something she had promised to protect with her life. The envelope had been given to her 11 days earlier, though it felt as though it carried the weight of 11 years. She remembered every detail of the moment an old man named Solomon Adeyemi had pressed it into her palm, with hands that were already trembling from illness, his breath uneven, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity she had never forgotten. "This goes only to Damien," he had told her, his voice thin but absolutely certain, the voice of a man giving his last order before the world took him. Not his assistant, not his lawyer, not anyone standing near him, only his hands. "Promise me, Amara," she had promised, the way people promise things they do not yet understand the full weight of, and 3 days later, Solomon Adeyemi was gone, leaving behind a fortune worth billions of naira and a secret that his own son did not yet know existed. Amara rose from her narrow bed and moved through the small routines that had become second nature to her. Boiling water on a single gas burner, folding the thin blanket at the foot of her mattress, listening to the neighbors already awake and arguing cheerfully somewhere beyond the thin wall. She worked 2 jobs most weeks, cleaning offices before dawn and selling fabric in a small market stall in the afternoons, stitching together enough income to cover rent, food, and the occasional letter home to a younger brother, studying in a town 2 hours north of the city. None of her neighbors knew about the envelope hidden beneath her pillow, and she preferred it that way, since a secret shared even once could easily become a secret lost. She had learned early in life that trust was the only currency the poor could offer freely, and she intended to spend hers carefully, on exactly the promise she had made to a dying stranger who had turned out to be anything but ordinary. She took 2 buses and walked the final distance on foot, because the fare for a third bus was money she needed for the week ahead, and there was no version of this errand that could wait for comfort. The towers of Adeyemi Holdings rose out of Victoria Island, like something built to remind ordinary people exactly how small they were, all glass and chrome and silence, the kind of silence that expensive buildings seem to manufacture on purpose. When she reached the entrance, the security guards looked at her sandals, then her dress, then her face, and made their decision before she had said a single word. "This is not a place for people looking for handouts," one of them told her. Not unkindly, simply as though he were stating a fact of nature, the way one might mention that the tide comes in twice a day. She did not argue. She simply asked if she could wait, and something in her tone made him step aside, just enough to let her stand near the pillars instead of out on the street. She waited for 3 hours on a marble bench that seemed designed to discourage exactly the kind of patience she was showing. Employees walked past her in expensive shoes, glancing down only long enough to form an opinion and then look away, murmuring to each other about the girl who was clearly there to beg for money or worse, to cause some kind of scene that would end in security escorting her out within the hour. None of them asked her name. None of them imagined that the envelope pressed against her chest held anything more valuable than a request for charity, because in their minds, poverty and importance could never occupy the same body at the same time. Upstairs, on the 40th floor, Damien Adeyemi sat in a glass conference room, negotiating a shipping contract worth more money than most of the people waiting below him would see in several lifetimes, entirely unaware that a woman carrying his father's final words was sitting in his own lobby, growing more anxious with every passing minute. It was near the end of the third hour that the elevator doors opened, and the air in the lobby seemed to change all at once, the way a room changes when someone enters it who is used to being obeyed. Vanessa Cole stepped out first, trailed by two assistants carrying tablets and coffee, her heels striking the marble with the confident rhythm of someone who had never once been told to wait for anything in her life. Vanessa's eyes moved across the lobby the way a hawk's eyes move across a field, searching for exactly one thing, something worth noticing, and they landed on Amara almost instantly. The contrast was too obvious to ignore. A woman in a faded dress sitting stiffly among marble columns designed for people wearing silk, and Vanessa's mouth curved into the kind of smile that had nothing warm behind it. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, though her tone made clear that help was the last thing she intended to offer. "Or are you simply lost?" Amara rose to her feet, steadied her voice, and answered with the same calm she had carried through 3 buses and 3 hours of waiting. "I have a letter meant only for Mr. Damien Adeyemi," she said. "It is urgent, and I was asked to deliver it into his hands directly." Vanessa's smile did not move, but something behind her eyes sharpened. The particular alertness of a woman who had spent years guarding a fortune she had not built and was determined to protect it from every direction at once. "Give it to me," Vanessa said, extending a manicured hand as though the matter were already settled, as though the request itself were a formality rather than a question. Amara hesitated, remembering the old man's final instruction, the promise she had made at his bedside, and she tried to explain that the letter could only go to Damien himself. But Vanessa did not wait for the explanation to finish. She reached forward and pulled the envelope from Amara's grip with a swift, practiced motion, the kind of movement a person makes when they believe consequences belong to other people. She did not open it. She did not read a single word of what was inside. Instead, in front of the security guards, the assistants, and a dozen employees who had paused their morning to watch, she tore the envelope down the center, then again and again, until the red wax seal cracked apart, and its pieces scattered across the marble floor like broken teeth. The paper fluttered down in uneven pieces, some landing near Amara's feet, others drifting toward the elevator doors, and for a moment nobody in the lobby moved. Then laughter broke out among a few of the younger staff, quiet at first, then louder, the easy laughter of people who assumed cruelty must be justified if someone important was the one delivering it. Amara dropped to her knees without a second of hesitation, gathering the torn fragments as quickly as her hands could move, though several pieces had already slipped beneath the feet of onlookers, who did not bother to step aside. Vanessa watched her for a moment, with visible satisfaction, then turned to the nearest guard and said, in a voice loud enough for the whole lobby to hear, "Get this woman out of my building before she tries something else." 2 guards moved forward immediately, taking Amara by the arms and lifting her before she could gather even half of what remained. At that exact moment, 40 floors above, Damien Adeyemi stepped out of his meeting and walked toward the private elevator that connected directly to the ground floor lobby, glancing at his phone rather than the glass wall that overlooked the atrium below. He caught only the faintest glimpse through the reflection of the elevator doors. As they closed, a young woman in a faded dress being escorted out through the front entrance by 2 of his own security staff, her hands still clutching something small and torn. He frowned, not because he understood what he was seeing, but because something about the moment felt wrong in a way he could not yet name. When the elevator reached the ground floor and the doors slid open, he asked the first person he saw, almost absently, who had just been asked to leave. Vanessa answered before anyone else could, smoothing the front of her blazer as though nothing unusual had happened at all. "Some woman trying to con her way in with a fake letter," she said, brushing an invisible piece of lint from her sleeve. "I handled it. You don't need to worry about people like that showing up here." Damien nodded slowly, accepted her answer the way a busy man accepts a small inconvenience, and turned to walk toward his office, unaware that the truth of the morning had already begun to unravel behind him. It was Baba Tunde, the elderly building manager who had worked for the Adeyemi family for almost 3 decades, who noticed the fragments still scattered near the base of the reception desk long after the commotion had ended. He knelt slowly, his joints protesting the movement, and began collecting the pieces the cleaning staff had not yet swept away, more out of old habit than any real suspicion. But as he lifted one larger fragment close to his tired eyes, his hands went still. Pressed faintly into the paper was the outline of a wax seal he had seen exactly once before, decades earlier, stamped onto letters that only ever came from one man. It was Chief Solomon Adeyemi's personal seal, the one he had used for private family correspondence long before his son had ever taken over the company, a mark that had not been used publicly in over 20 years. Babatunde's hands trembled as he gathered every fragment he could find, wrapping them carefully in a clean handkerchief, understanding instinctively that whatever this letter had been, it was not the work of a con artist looking for charity. He carried the fragments upstairs immediately, bypassing the usual channels of scheduling and permission, walking straight into Damien's office with an urgency that made the younger executive look up in surprise. "Sir, forgive me for interrupting," the old man said, his voice unsteady, "but I believe something terrible has just happened in your lobby." He placed the handkerchief on the desk and unfolded it carefully, revealing the torn pieces of paper, the broken red wax still faintly visible along one jagged edge. Damien's expression changed the instant he saw it, recognition flooding through him before he had even fully processed what he was looking at. He had seen that seal exactly twice in his life, both times on letters his father had written with his own hands. Letters meant only for family, never for business, never for strangers. "Where did you find this?" Damien asked quietly, though some part of him had already begun to suspect the answer, and Babatunde told him everything he had witnessed only an hour before. Damien called for the security footage immediately, pulling up the morning's recordings on the large screen in his office, while Babatunde stood quietly beside him, watching the same scene unfold from a different angle. The footage showed Amara arriving early, sitting patiently for hours without disturbing a single person, rising respectfully when Vanessa approached her, and speaking calmly, even as her letter was ripped apart in front of a laughing crowd. There was no aggression in her posture, no attempt at deception, nothing that resembled the story Vanessa had told him only an hour earlier. What the footage showed instead was a woman being humiliated for the simple act of trying to keep a promise, and a fiancé who had lied to his face without hesitation. Damien felt something cold settle into his chest, the particular anger of a man realizing that someone he trusted had deceived him easily, and worse, had seemed to enjoy it. He asked his assistant to find out everything possible about the woman in the video, and to do it within the hour. While Damien sat replaying the footage a second, and then a third time, Amara was walking home through the same crowded streets she had walked that morning, though now her steps were heavier, her hands still stained faintly with dust from the marble floor. She had managed to save only a handful of torn fragments, tucked carefully into her cloth pouch, and though she could not read enough of any single piece to understand what her promise had actually protected, she understood clearly that she had failed the old man who trusted her. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed that evening and wept quietly, not for herself, but for a dying man's final wish that she had carried faithfully for 11 days, only to watch it destroyed in 11 seconds. She had no way of knowing that across the city, in an office 40 floors above the very lobby where her humiliation had taken place, the machinery of an entire family's future had just begun turning in her direction. That night, Damien's phone rang past 11, an hour at which very few people dared to call him, and the name on the screen belonged to Barrister Musa Bello, the family's longtime lawyer who had handled every legal matter for the Adeyemi name for more than 20 years. His voice carried an urgency Damien had rarely heard from him, even during the most difficult negotiations of his career. "I need to speak with you tonight, not tomorrow," Musa said, "about something your father asked me to hold in confidence until the right moment arrived." Damien felt his pulse quicken, some instinct telling him that this call and the shredded letter downstairs were pieces of the exact same puzzle. He agreed to meet immediately, and within the hour, the two men sat across from each other in Damien's private study, The torn fragments of the letter spread carefully between them on the desk. Musa explained, choosing his words with the caution of a man who had kept a secret for a very long time, that roughly 6 months before his death, Solomon had come to him privately, with instructions that no one, not even Damien, was to know about until the letter had either been delivered or its fate confirmed. Solomon had written something with his own hand, sealed it with his personal wax, and arranged for a woman named Amara Okoye to deliver it directly to Damien whenever the time was right. A plan set in motion long before his final illness took hold. "Your father told me," Musa continued, his voice lowering, "that certain transfers of ownership, certain conditions attached to parts of the family estate, could not proceed properly unless that letter reached your hands intact. If it has been destroyed, we may be facing complications neither of us are prepared for." Damien stared at the torn fragments on the desk, the weight of his father's final wishes suddenly feeling far heavier than he had understood even an hour earlier. Musa also reminded Damien, gently but firmly, that Solomon had never been a man given to dramatic gestures, and that if he had gone to such lengths to arrange a secret delivery through a stranger, rather than simply calling his own son to his bedside, the reasons behind that choice deserved serious consideration. He recalled quiet conversations with Solomon in his final months, moments when the old man had grown unusually cautious about who was allowed near his private study, moments that had seemed strange at the time, but now took on a different weight entirely. "Your father was not a suspicious man by nature," Musa said, folding his hands on the desk between them, "which is exactly why I believe we should take this seriously, rather than assume grief has made an old man's instructions unreliable." Damien nodded slowly, staring at the torn fragments, as though they might rearrange themselves through sheer force of his attention, already sensing that the answers waiting inside them would cost him something before this was over. Vanessa arrived at the study some time later, having heard through one of the household staff that Musa had come at such a late hour, and she attempted to steer the conversation the moment she stepped through the door. "I'm sure whatever that woman was carrying wasn't anything important," she said lightly, resting a hand on Damien's shoulder in a gesture that had always calmed him before, though tonight it did nothing at all. "People show up with fake letters all the time trying to get attention from wealthy families. You know that better than anyone." Damien turned to look at her slowly, and for the first time in their 3 years together, something in his expression made her hand fall away on its own. "You told me she was a con artist," he said, his voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through the room. "You never mentioned that the letter had my father's seal on it. Did you even look before you tore it apart?" Vanessa opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came out that sounded convincing, and the silence that followed told Damien more than any explanation could have. He did not raise his voice, though every part of him wanted to, because Musa was still in the room, and because raising his voice had never been his way of handling betrayal. Instead, he simply told her, in a tone colder than she had ever heard from him, that he needed time to think, and that she should return to her own residence for the night. Vanessa left without another word, though the look on her face carried something closer to fear than embarrassment, the particular fear of a woman realizing that a carefully built future might be cracking beneath her. Long after she had gone, Damien sat alone with the torn fragments of his father's letter, running his thumb along the broken wax seal, and made a decision that surprised even himself. He would find the woman from the video, not through assistance, not through security reports, but himself, in person, whatever it took to understand what she had been trying so hard to protect. The following morning, Damien arrived in Ajagunal for the first time in his life, stepping out of a car that looked entirely out of place among the narrow lanes and low tin roofs, drawing stares from every direction the moment his shoes touched the uneven ground. He asked around carefully, describing the woman from the footage, and it took less than 20 minutes before someone pointed him toward a small house near the end of a crowded lane, saying only that everyone knew the quiet girl who worked 2 jobs and never asked anyone for anything. When Amara opened her door and saw the man from the photographs the newspapers occasionally ran, standing on her doorstep in a neighborhood that had never seen a car like his, she froze for a long moment, uncertain whether to be afraid or relieved. "I came to apologize," Damien said simply, before she could speak, "and to ask you what my father wanted me to know." She invited him inside, though the space could barely hold the two of them, and the single chair she offered him. And for the first time, Damien saw with his own eyes the life this woman actually lived, so different from the story Vanessa had told him only a day earlier. There was no evidence of dishonesty anywhere in that small room, no hint of the manipulation he had been led to expect, only the quiet order of someone who had learned to make very little stretch very far. Amara told him everything, starting with the afternoon 11 days earlier when she had found an elderly man collapsed on a busy roadside, his breathing shallow, his skin pale, while dozens of people walked past assuming he was simply another drunk who had fallen asleep in the heat. She had stopped when no one else would, had carried water to his lips and stayed with him until an ambulance arrived, and had visited him twice at the hospital afterward, simply because something in his eyes had told her he was frightened and alone. She had almost walked past him that afternoon, the way dozens of others had, assuming he was simply another tired body resting in the shade of a market awning during the worst heat of the day. It was the stillness of his hands that stopped her, the unnatural way they lay open at his sides, and something in her refused to keep walking once she noticed it. She knelt beside him on the cracked pavement, checked his breathing, called for help from the nearest shop owner, and stayed pressed close to his side, even as strangers gathered to stare rather than assist. When the ambulance finally arrived, she rode partway with him, simply because no one else seemed willing to, holding his hand the entire time while he drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring words she could not yet understand the importance of. It was only on her second visit that she learned the old man's name was Solomon Adeyemi, though even then the name had meant little to her, since she rarely followed news about wealthy families whose lives seemed to exist on an entirely different planet from her own. Over the following days, as his health worsened, Solomon had asked her to return, and each time he seemed to trust her a little more, sharing small pieces of his life, his regrets, his worries about the people closest to him. He told her once, in a moment of unusual honesty, that he had grown suspicious of certain people in his son's life, though he never named names, only said that wealth attracted loyalty that was often loyalty to money rather than to the man himself. He said that Amara reminded him of his late wife, a woman who had never once cared what anyone owned, only what kind of person they chose to be when no one was watching. It was during their final conversation that he had pressed the sealed envelope into her hands and asked for the promise that had guided every one of her steps since. Damien listened without interrupting, his hands folded tightly in his lap, absorbing every detail as though each one were a fragment of the letter itself, restoring meaning to something that had been torn apart before he ever had the chance to read it. When Amara finished speaking, she reached beneath her small bed and pulled out the cloth pouch, opening it carefully to reveal the fragments she had managed to save from the marble floor, pieces stained slightly with dust but otherwise intact. "I couldn't save all of it," she admitted, her voice thick with the guilt she had carried since the moment the paper first tore. "I tried, but there were so many pieces, and people were laughing, and the guards pulled me away before I could finish." Damien took the pouch from her hands, as gently as if it contained something fragile enough to shatter twice, and told her, with a sincerity that surprised them both, that she had done more than enough, that she had kept her promise further than most people ever would have. Within 2 days, Damien had assembled a small team in his private study, including Barrister Musa, a document restoration specialist flown in from Abuja, and Amara herself, who insisted on being present, since the fragments had been entrusted to her care in the first place. They worked slowly under bright lamps, matching torn edges by the grain of the paper and the faint ink bleeding through each piece, reconstructing sentence by sentence what had once been a single continuous letter written in Solomon's own unsteady hand. As the fragments came together, phrases began to emerge, fragments of a father's voice, speaking directly to his son from beyond the point where speech itself had failed him. Solomon wrote of regrets he had never voiced aloud, of choices made too late, and conversations he wished he had started decades earlier, his handwriting growing shakier toward what they assumed was the letter's end. He wrote, in words that made Damien's throat tighten as the restoration specialist read them aloud, that he had watched his son build an empire but worried constantly that Damien had surrounded himself with people who loved the empire more than they loved him. He thanked Amara by name, describing her as the only person in his final weeks who had asked nothing of him and given everything anyway. A kindness he said he intended to repay in ways she could not yet imagine. And then, in a passage that made the entire room fall silent, Solomon wrote a direct warning about someone close to Damien, someone he described only as the woman who measures love by the size of what it can buy. No name was written, though everyone in the room understood exactly who the words described, and Musa exchanged a long look with Damien that needed no further explanation. But even with dozens of fragments carefully reassembled, one crucial section remained missing entirely. A gap in the middle of the letter, where several pieces had apparently been lost during the chaos in the lobby, either swept away by cleaning staff or crushed beyond recognition beneath careless feet. Without that missing section, the full meaning of Solomon's final instructions remained incomplete, and Musa warned that certain legal transfers tied to the letter could not proceed without every word accounted for. Damien ordered a full search of the building, instructing staff to check every corner of the lobby, every trash receptacle, every crevice where a scrap of paper might have drifted unnoticed. 2 days passed with no results, and frustration began creeping into what had otherwise felt like a story slowly finding its way toward resolution. It was Vanessa, unexpectedly, who became the center of the search's next turn, though not in the way anyone had anticipated. One of the younger assistants who had witnessed the incident in the lobby came forward quietly to Musa, admitting that she had seen Vanessa's personal assistant collecting several loose fragments from the floor that same afternoon, tucking them into a designer handbag rather than leaving them for cleaning staff to sweep away. When confronted, Vanessa denied everything with practiced composure, insisting she had never touched the remaining pieces and had no idea what the assistant was talking about. But Musa, a lawyer who had spent decades reading the small inconsistencies people leave behind when they lie, requested access to the building's full security footage from that day, footage that had not yet been fully reviewed beyond the initial confrontation in the lobby. The additional footage, when finally examined frame by frame, showed exactly what the young assistant had described. Vanessa's personal aide crouching briefly near the reception desk minutes after the confrontation, sliding several small pieces of paper into her bag, while glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching closely. Confronted with the recording itself, Vanessa's composure finally cracked, and she admitted, with visible resentment rather than remorse, that she had kept the pieces out of curiosity, wondering what could possibly matter enough to a stranger that she would wait 3 hours in a lobby just to deliver it. She had read enough of the fragments to understand they concerned her, and had hidden them rather than risk whatever truth they might reveal about her place in the family's future. Damien listened to her confession with an expression that had grown steadily colder throughout the entire ordeal, and when she finally finished speaking, he asked only one question: where are they now? The missing fragments were recovered that same evening from inside a small jewelry box in Vanessa's private quarters, hidden beneath a layer of scarves as though she had genuinely believed no one would ever think to look there. Musa carried them back to the study personally, and the restoration specialist resumed her careful work immediately, fitting the final pieces into the gaps that had remained empty for days. Slowly, the missing section of Solomon's letter took shape, and with it, the true ending of a father's final message to his son emerged from beneath the dust and creases of paper that had traveled through more hands than it was ever meant to. The final section of the letter, once fully restored, began with a line that made Damien's hands tremble as he read it aloud for the first time. "If you are reading these words," Solomon had written, "then Amara has kept the promise she made to a dying man, and for that alone, she has already proven herself worthy of more trust than most people earn in a lifetime." He went on to write plainly, without the careful diplomacy that had defined so much of his public life, that he wanted his son to remember 3 things above everything else the family had built. "Never judge a person by the clothes on their back," he wrote, "because the truest loyalty rarely comes wrapped in expensive fabric. The most faithful people are often those without status, without title, without anything to gain from offering their honesty. And the most dangerous person in a man's life is very often the one standing closest to him, smiling the widest, asking for nothing in front of others, while quietly calculating everything behind closed doors." Damien read the final lines twice, his voice breaking slightly the second time, unable to fully separate the businessman he had become from the son who had just heard his father's true feelings for the first time in years. Musa remained quiet, allowing him the space to absorb what had just been read, while the restoration specialist stepped back respectfully, sensing that this moment belonged to the family alone. When Damien finally looked up, his decision seemed to have already formed itself somewhere deep within him, arriving fully shaped rather than debated. That same night, in front of Musa and several senior household staff, he ended his engagement to Vanessa Cole, informing her calmly that whatever they had built together had been built on a foundation his own father had warned him about with his dying breath. Vanessa's protests grew louder as the reality settled over her. Arguments about years invested and a future promised. But Damien had already made peace with the cost of the truth, and nothing she said changed the outcome that evening. It was only after Vanessa had gone, after the house had settled back into an unfamiliar quiet, that Musa mentioned something he had almost forgotten in the chaos of the previous days. Solomon had left behind a second envelope, smaller than the first, stored separately in his private safe, with instructions that it only be opened once the first letter had been delivered and read in full. Damien retrieved it himself, his hands steadier now than they had been all week, and broke the seal to find a short, handwritten note, along with several official documents folded neatly inside. The envelope was addressed simply, in Solomon's careful handwriting, to Amara Okoye, and Damien felt it would be wrong for anyone but her to open it first. He arranged to meet her the following afternoon, this time not in the marble lobby where she had once been humiliated, but in the quiet garden behind the family estate, where the noise of the city felt distant enough to allow for a different kind of conversation. When she arrived, uncertain why she had been summoned again, Damien handed her the envelope without explanation, simply asking her to read it herself. Inside, alongside a short letter written entirely in Solomon's own hand, were the deed to a modest but comfortable home in a quiet part of Lagos, documents establishing an education fund covering any course of study she wished to pursue, and papers granting her a small ownership stake in a charitable foundation the Adeyemi family had quietly funded for years. Solomon's note read simply, "You never once asked me for anything. Not money, not favors, not even gratitude, and it is precisely because you asked for nothing that I wanted to give you everything you deserved but never requested." Amara read the words 3 times before she fully believed them, her hands shaking so badly that Damien gently took the papers from her grip and held them steady himself. Tears fell freely down her face, not from shock alone, but from the sudden, overwhelming understanding that a promise kept in silence had somehow returned to her 1,000 times over. Damien watched her reaction with an expression softer than anyone at the company had seen from him in years. Something in his chest, loosening for the first time since his father's death, had left him carrying so much weight alone. He told her quietly that his father had chosen well, that whatever grief had followed Solomon's passing felt somehow lighter, knowing the old man's final wishes had landed exactly where they were meant to. For the first time since the entire ordeal began, he allowed himself a genuine smile, the kind that had nothing to do with business deals or careful public appearances, simply the quiet satisfaction of watching a wrong finally set right. In the weeks that followed, Damien made Amara an offer that neither of them had expected to arrive so soon after everything that had happened. He asked her to help oversee the very charitable foundation her new shares now belonged to, explaining that few people understood the needs of Lagos's poorest communities as clearly as someone who had lived among them her entire life. Amara hesitated at first, uncertain whether she was ready to step into a world so far removed from everything familiar to her, worried that people would see only the scandal and not the substance behind her new position. But she thought of Solomon, of the promise she had made at his bedside, and of the quiet dignity he had shown her even while dying, and she realized that refusing the opportunity would be its own kind of betrayal, a failure to use what had been so carefully given to help others, the way she once needed help herself. She accepted the role within the week, and news of her appointment spread quickly through Lagos, carried first by whispers among Adeyemi Holdings employees, and then by wider attention, once local newspapers picked up the story of the poor woman who had delivered a billionaire's final letter and ended up rewriting her own future in the process. Many of the same employees who had laughed as her letter was torn apart now found themselves working alongside her, and few of them met her eyes without a flicker of embarrassment passing across their faces. Vanessa, meanwhile, discovered that Lagos society had a long memory for humiliation, particularly when it belonged to someone who had once looked down on others from a position she no longer occupied, and the invitations that once filled her calendar slowly disappeared one by one. Damien used the months following his father's death to restructure parts of the company according to values he now understood. Solomon had always held quietly in reserve, redirecting significant resources toward community programs in neighborhoods like Ajagunle that had never before seen investment from towers on Victoria Island. He often said, in the rare interviews he agreed to give, that his father had taught him more in death than in most of the years they shared while he was alive, a lesson delivered not through words spoken directly, but through a letter that had to be torn apart and painstakingly rebuilt before its meaning could finally be understood. Amara, for her part, never allowed her new position to change the quiet steadiness that had defined her long before any of this began, and those who worked alongside her often said she treated every visitor to the Foundation's offices exactly the way she once wished someone had treated her, with patience, with respect, and without a single glance at what they were wearing. Months later, Amara returned to the marble lobby, where her ordeal had first begun, arriving this time not as a stranger asking to be seen, but as a director of the Foundation attending a scheduled meeting. The employees who had once laughed as her letter was torn to pieces rose from their seats as she crossed the floor, some out of professional courtesy, others out of a genuine respect that had grown slowly over the preceding months. Damien watched from the balcony above, standing beside a large framed portrait of his father that had recently been restored and hung near the entrance, and he found himself speaking softly, more to the portrait than to anyone standing nearby. "You were right," he said quietly, his eyes moving from the painting down to the woman crossing the lobby below. The most valuable thing that ever walked through these doors wasn't wearing anything expensive at all. It was someone brave enough to keep a promise all the way to the end, even when the whole world seemed determined to stop her. The city stretched out beyond the tall windows behind him, towers and shanties existing side by side under the same wide sky, a reminder that dignity had never once depended on the size of a person's home or the label on their clothing. In the years that followed, few people in Lagos remembered the exact details of the shipping contracts Damien Adeyemi signed that year, or the exact figures behind the mergers his company completed, because business triumphs of that kind tended to blur together after enough time had passed. What they remembered instead, told and retold at family dinners and market stalls across the city, was the story of a woman who had waited 3 hours on a cold marble bench simply to keep a promise to a dying man, and who had never once raised her voice, even as her only proof was torn to pieces in front of a laughing crowd. Parents in neighborhoods like Ajagunle began telling their children about her when they wanted to explain that character was not something money could purchase or poverty could erase, that a person's worth revealed itself most clearly in the moments when no reward seemed possible at all. Vanessa Cole eventually left Lagos altogether, resettling quietly in a city where her name carried no history, though those who had known her best said she never fully understood what she had lost, was never the engagement itself, but the version of herself capable of standing in a stranger's shoes for even a single moment. Amara never forgot the weight of that torn envelope, and she kept a single fragment of the original paper framed in her office at the Foundation, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of exactly how easily the truth could be dismissed by those unwilling to look closely enough. She often told the young women she mentored through the Foundation's programs that dignity was not something granted by wealth or title, but something carried quietly inside a person long before anyone else recognized it, waiting patiently for the moment it would finally be seen. Damien, for his part, kept his father's restored letter locked in the same safe where the second envelope had once waited, reading it every year on the anniversary of Solomon's passing, each time finding some new layer of meaning in words he now knew by heart. As the afternoon light shifted across the marble floor of the lobby that had once witnessed both cruelty and redemption, the story of a torn letter and a kept promise settled quietly into the history of a family that had finally learned, at great cost, that loyalty worth having could never be bought, only earned, and never once demanded, only given freely by someone who had nothing to gain and everything to lose.